So, you know, why not in South Asia? Why not here?
But I mean, to stress one thing about Documenta though that's unique is it was the first thing of a World's Fair model that wasn't produced as such. And it never had any sort of, it was specifically on, of course it had economic underpinnings, but the raison d'etre of it always was this idea of image, this idea of society, and this idea of what kind of people we want to be, was first and foremost. And that's not the case in most biennials.
As a badge for the nation, for the German nation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very unique case.
The West German nation at that point. So it's also a badge of the capitalist part of Germany versus the communist part of Germany.
Right.
So it played a role in that as
right
well.
on the border.
So art and artists were used as tools in a very different dialogue back then. So that's one of the jobs that artists have to play, right? As seeing themselves as playing roles in broader political dialogues that take place using them as mute actors. Would you say that that's a job that's to be resisted or to be happily taken on?
Well, you don't have to, but you know.
Yeah,
but do you want to be ethical? Is the root question. Yeah.
And I want to ask if this is the role of the artist. What is the role of the curators? Because they are much more than 10 years before. They were more curators today.
I think that's the question is what if the role of the artist has changed, and you know, and of course I think we all agree that it's changed in one way or another. I mean, for me, that role changed after the invention of photography. You know, when artists had to realize that they had to do something else. You know, before photography, artists had a certain set of responsibilities in relationship to the production of images that would be engaged for one reason or another in the world. But post-photography, the artists had to start really rethinking on a very profound and primary level what their job was. And I'm not sure that we've ever answered that. And that questioning has led to the kind of questioning that curators and institutions that support curators have to ask themselves. Because if artists' jobs have changed, then how has the curator's job changed? The curator used to be the public connoisseur, right? There's so much art being made. Somebody has to make decisions about what's good. And that decision was made by people who felt that they had the training and the background. They usually came from wealthy families. They were usually the third or fourth in line, so they weren't going to inherit the family business or the family money, so they put them into an art museum to keep them safe. But they had good taste because mom made sure they had that. And that was art museum curators up until through the 1960s in the United States. For the most part, they came from really good families, well-bred, and they knew which fork to use at a fancy dinner party. And basically, they knew the names of the most important artists. They didn't have any particular point of view. They just were well-behaved and polite, and they were not going to make trouble. Now, post-1960s, that changed for a lot of reasons. The middle class got entry to the art world, both as artists and then as curators. Curators always follow artists by at least a decade. So artists from the middle class had access to the art world because of educational changes, because of just changes in the body politic, accepting people for other reasons. This is definitely a post-war Holian thing.
You're talking about the United States.
Yes, in the United States and in Europe as well. I mean, it began to change quite profoundly. When I began work as a curator, you know, most of the older curators I knew came from serious wealth and had a very different attitude about the world than I did, coming from a middle class background. And so I saw that change. But even more profoundly, as my career changed as a curator, I recognized that my job wasn't necessarily to make decisions on behalf of people who were unable to make decisions themselves. And now that we're in an age of crowdsourcing, now that we're in a post-digital, post-YouTube era, we recognize that the curator's job has nothing to do with making choices for people, but it has to do with establishing a contest of values and ideas in which everyone can participate.
But they have a certain power also.
There's a certain power in establishing that contest, but the curators today, in my opinion, the curator's role is to establish this contest of values and ideas, that's in the words of Homi Bhabha, and to step back and be a participant in that contest, but not to control the game. And the better the curator is the more transparent the structure that they can.
That strikes me as idealistic. It seems to me that curators I mean, the more artists become actors, the more curators become producers.
Yes,
They are
yes.
producers. I mean, they're like producers in Hollywood, right?
And control freaks.
Yeah,
basically.
they control a lot.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's what I think that's how they see their role, right? I mean, to get art made in certain sense,
Well, I think there's a range of players,
Yeah.
and again, some of them are more honest and open about the game they play, and some of them are, you know, in the under the control of others, other unseen forces. You know, museums are not blameless, and museums are not outside of the market. That is the way that the structure is built today, to hide the influence of the people in power. And there are many curators who are happy, either out of ignorance or out of greed or out of cupidity, to play that role. And then there are extraordinary curators who really see their job as constructing this contest of values and ideas, and who see the responsibility and the authority that they have as one that requires an enormous amount of seriousness of purpose and a willingness to take on very difficult tasks. Yes.
Well, curators, in the sense that we understand it, have come into the Indian scene only in the last 10 years or so. And I think because of the lack of alternative spaces which we spoke about, particularly the absence of museums, and there are no museums, no public museums so far as contemporary art is concerned in India. The only serious contemporary museum is the Devi Art Foundation, which is a trust, essentially. So the whole idea is...
This is how the Whitney began,
Yeah.
kind of as a quasi-private trust too.
So essentially curators have to work within the commercial gallery circuit. And that's got its own gods you have to pay homage to and worship. As a result of which curators are severely restrained, and there is no real scope to put forward a comprehensive curatorial, because you're immediately turned around and asked by the gallery with which you're working, is this going to make money?
Exactly.
And at which point of time, if it is an exhibition of installation art, you turn around and say, no, it's not. At which point you're told, well, then we don't want to put it up. So then the curator, if he or she has got to put up an exhibition, makes a fundamental compromise so far as his or her vision is concerned. And we've seen a diluting of ideas so far as curatorial practice is concerned, merely because there aren't public institutions of sufficient gravity.
But this is where you get to the need for a different kind of institution, and it could be that an institution like Documenta, or like, you know, a repeating public exhibition that doesn't have a vested interest in a collection or in a set of trustees, but can rotate curators and directors every 3 or 4 or 5 years and construct anew every time a set of questions and concerns about assessing the quality and values and ideas that are taking place at a given time, may be the only way of functioning, if you can do that outside of the marketplace. In other words, if you have the kind of subsidy, I don't know what the Documenta budget is this year, but you know, it used to be pretty big. They're usually pretty enormous budgets. Most museums would die to have a budget like Documenta has for their once every 5 year show. And maybe museums really have become obsolete. Many museums, as players in this game, can no longer play because they're no longer honest brokers in those terms, and can't be counted upon to do that because they have too many conflicts.
But why? I mean, why aren't there grassroots shows? Why isn't some kid putting up, curating, you know, a show in some little space somewhere or some big?
They try to serve all these points. What you said before, you have to go to a curator, you have to do
So
this.
the question is, why aren't there grassroots alternative efforts in India?
Yeah, why aren't they just doing it?
You have
that's
the
the way it
power.
works everywhere.
That's
Or are
not-
they doing it? I don't know. Are people
Not enough.
Yeah.
Not enough. Because, you know, there's also the issue of India being the bureaucratic country that it is, everything needs permissions and multiple.
What would prevent somebody from just throwing something up in a disused space?
The owner of the disused space would come and claim some sort of rent, which you may or may not have at that stage.
But there must be some
Of
decent
course,
person
of
who
course.
will allow
No,
that.
of course. You know, there
For
are
example, the townhouse gallery in Cairo. It was also something very new, and they started with one room, and
I've done.
it was a non-profit. Non-profit was important. It was non-profit, and it became very powerful.
But wouldn't we say that one of the major factors in what's changed, for instance, the role of the curator and even the role of the institution since the late 60s in the US and in Europe has been the rise of the artist space? That is to say, artists taking upon themselves
Yes.
the responsibility of organizing for themselves and not relying on outside forces, not relying on government, not relying on institutions, not relying on the school system, to say, we as a band of artists are going to create an exhibition space for art that makes sense to us as a group. Why hasn't that happened in India?
So I think that we need to continuously do these initiatives. These initiatives are difficult to manage because once you start showing good work, which I would say good and saleable work, whatever that might mean to whoever, I feel there will be galleries coming and picking up those guys, whose work is sold, and then they're out. But then there are many kids coming up because we have a very dynamic art school there. So you have new people, and that's the way we have been doing work for a number of years. And especially, you see, where I'm concerned, I've been looking at the work of over the last 5 to 7 years, I found the work of artists coming from Mofussil towns and villages coming into art school, bringing a completely new language into Indian art, which draws upon their own personal experiences, their own visual experiences, and which has references to rituals and all kinds of things which they've grown up with.
I think that's very important that that's happening in your part of India. Perhaps the fact that it hasn't caught fire, and maybe that is we need to discuss the role of the media in fanning those flames. One of the things that we've seen in general is that the power and role of the art magazine and now the internet in addition to the art magazine has had been an enormous factor in creating change and creating a space for change.
It has, and now I think it's greatly diminished, tremendously diminished.
Is the art magazine on its way out?
No, I don't think so. But I think it will continue in a fairly diminished capacity.
In favor of what? What will take its place?
Silence, sadly.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, or the crowd. I mean, just people talking. But I think that really what you get is silence when you don't have any sort of leadership in the discussion. I think that's a sad thing.
Is there leadership in the discussion in India?
I think not. Sandhya and I both contribute to 3 or 4 of the leading art magazines in the country, and it's the same 5 or 6 people who write for all of them, and the discussion tends to become extremely self-referential, and no one takes the slightest notice of what's going on in these magazines. The artists will only look at it if they've got a good review, so I think the media hasn't grasped the situation so far as contemporary art in India is concerned.
What have they missed?
They've missed the whole story. They've missed the whole story. It's a cabal, and essentially, if you've made it as an artist, you will get your 2 reviews in Art India no matter what. The magazines are unwilling to cover shows by young artists. They're unwilling to go into alternative spaces. It's essentially a lazy approach, whereby you cater to the familiar, and thereby they've missed the whole point. They've missed the whole story.